Well, welcome all. I'm David Sturman, a senior policy analyst with New America's International Security Program. We're here to talk about the 17th anniversary of Guantanamo's use in the War on Terror. We've held this event, I believe, pretty much every year since 2011. It's one of the most important events we do, marking a critical decision that the U.S. made in the War on Terror that still shapes us today. At last count, there were 40 people still left and detained in Guantanamo. When Trump took over a couple of years ago, there were, I believe, 41. During that time, one person was transferred out as part of an ongoing court case in Spain, I believe, extradited, and then no one else has left. And in fact, I believe the office in charge of both relocation and tracking those who were already gone was closed. On the other hand, no one has been put into Guantanamo since the Bush administration, so now more than a decade. Yet even so, we still have discussions of potentially placement of ISIS fighters there, so it hasn't gone away. So to discuss all of that, we have Andy Worthington, co-founder of Closed Guantanamo, Laura Pitter, Deputy Director of Human Rights Watch's U.S. program, and Thomas Wilner, also a co-founder of Closed Guantanamo and OF counsel at Sherman and Sterling. He was also the lead counsel for the Rasul and Boumediene cases, which really shaped the entire legal structure regarding where we are now with Guantanamo and the few advances that were successfully grabbed. So with that, I'll turn it over to them for short opening statements. We'll have some moderated discussion and then throw it out to you for your questions and answers. Andy?
Okay, hello everybody. Thank you, New America, for this. Thank you everybody for turning up. Those that I know, and there are many activists here that I do, and everybody that I don't know, thank you for turning up, because of course we're here to mark an occasion that is almost totally ignored in the US media. And how can that be? It's 17 years today that the prison opened, and that's 6,210 days. This is from a project that Tom and I set up as part of the Closed Guantanamo campaign called the Gitmo Clock. If you go and look at it, it counts in real time how long Guantanamo has been open, 6,210 days. Now, fundamentally, every single one of those days that the prison has been open ought to be a source of shame for all decent American people who care about the rule of law. Because Guantanamo is a place where people are not held according to the norms that apply if you're going to deprive somebody of their liberty. You either do that by them being a criminal suspect and you put them on trial, or you take them off the battlefield and hold them unmolested with the protections of the Geneva Conventions until the end of hostilities. But that didn't happen at Guantanamo. And the only countries that would do this kind of thing to people normally are countries that don't claim to respect the rule of law and that we would call, quite rightly, dictatorships. So while I'm delighted that you're all here and so thankful that you still care, where I'm staying across town in DC, I got up this morning and looked at the front cover of the New York Times, which had been delivered. Nothing. No mention of it. How could it not be front page news that for the 17th anniversary is today of this terrible, lawless place? And so we need to keep working to get to a position where one day we can have this place shut down. Obviously, the circumstances that we're under now, that's very difficult to imagine. We had 8 years of President Obama, who promised to close the prison and then fundamentally lacked the political will to do that in the face of opposition from Republicans. And then we got Donald Trump. And in not just in the field of Guantanamo, but in many of the things that Obama had done or had not undone that had carried on from the Bush administration, nobody was really thinking What would happen if somebody, really dangerous became the president of the United States? And the position we've been in, as David briefly mentioned, since Trump came into office, was he came in promising all kinds of outrageous things, that he was going to send new people to Guantanamo, that he wanted to bring back torture as official US policy. Now, fortunately, even with, unhinged advisors around him in many ways, not very far from Trump are people who realize that actually sending new prisoners to Guantanamo, I hope I'm right in this, sending new prisoners to Guantanamo is not helpful, because this is not a place where the law applies in any meaningful sense. It was set up so that the Bush administration could hold human beings entirely without any rights whatsoever and do what they wanted to do to them, which involved torturing them and abusing them. And that was the situation that prevailed for, fundamentally, actually, it was 2.5 years until the Rasool case, when lawyers got access to the prisoners, which pierced the veil of secrecy that had enabled torture to take place. But it took nearly 4.5 years for the Supreme Court to say to the Bush administration, you can't hold anyone without fundamentally understanding that everyone is protected by Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions, which prohibits torture and other forms of abuse. So Trump's worst impulses have been held in check. But we are looking today at a prison that he has effectively sealed shut. No one is getting out of Guantanamo under Donald Trump. And there's nothing that any of us can do about it, which should demonstrate to us how fundamentally wrong the place is. I could describe the men held there as political prisoners. I'm not saying that there aren't people there accused of serious crimes, but the means to prosecute them successfully are broken. There are people held there who, I am absolutely convinced, did nothing apart from be a very low-level foot soldier, let's say, in Afghanistan, who has had a bad attitude over the last 17 years because of the way they've been treated. We are stuck with this situation where no one can get out of the prison, and we need to highlight it. Perhaps you don't want to call the men held there Trump's political prisoners. Maybe you would like to call them Trump's personal prisoners. He has a little collection of 40 people that he holds in Guantanamo that no one can touch. Now, Tom will tell you that, I hope that there are still, hopefully, some legal ways in which this long, long disaster may be challenged. But we are fundamentally faced with this position where we have a president who was certainly elected, but in the power that he has over Guantanamo, he behaves like a despot. And we should not stand for that. So whatever we can do on an ongoing basis to resist that, and I've known some of you people for kind of 10 years now. We're all not as young as we were, but I think we all know that we can't give up on this, because I think you understand the fundamental importance of closing Guantanamo, and you feel the shame of this prison being open every single day because of what it represents. So, thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Andy, for your continued efforts to highlight what's happening there. Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now? You can hear me now? Okay, I'll try to talk into my microphone. I wanted to say thank you, Andy, for continuing to highlight what's been going on there and keeping his page going and updating, and his work has been essential. Yes, I completely agree, and I guess what I sort of wanted to talk about today, I actually just made this argument in an essay that's going to be out in a book that's coming out from Karen Greenberg's Fordham Center on Law and Security, that we need a sort of Korematsu-style reckoning about the standard that's been used at Guantanamo to keep people there. I mean, the reason why we still have 40 men there is because of the standard that the U.S. Supreme Court and the D.C. Circuit allowed to exist and created for keeping detainees at Guantanamo, and that the Obama administration fought hard to implement. And one reason why we need that is because we know so much more now about who the men were in Guantanamo, who the government was constantly saying were too dangerous to release and pose such a serious threat to security to do so. There's many have been released, and we know their stories. We know the story of Mohammed Slahi, and I see his lawyer in the audience here today. I know that he gave a presentation yesterday, I believe, through Skype this morning. He wrote the book Guantanamo Diaries and told the world, which became a New York Times bestseller, and told the world about who he was. And I think it's apparent when you read that you realize that this person that the U.S. government claimed was the most dangerous man at Guantanamo was nothing of the sort. We know who Boumediene is. We know who Mansour, who is now been placed in Serbia, is. We know who Murat Kurnaz is. We know who so many of the individuals who were released are. We know their stories, and we know that they are not the threat that the government was saying they were. And we know that now the standard was so low that kept the detainees there. And that standard actually was created in part by our new U.S. Supreme Court Justice, Brett Kavanaugh, who was one of 3 judges on the D.C. Circuit who created the initial standard at Guantanamo, which allowed the government to keep detainees there based on a preponderance of the evidence, which is the lowest form of evidence, basically one of the lowest forms in the criminal and any justice system in the U.S., using hearsay and using their so-called conditional probability analysis that allowed and forced actually the judges at the lower court to decide to consider even unreliable pieces of evidence in determining whether or not there was whether or not they could be held at Guantanamo. So, they forced the courts to use that standard in keeping detainees there, and they ended up having to reverse all the lower court decisions that they had of detainees who had been granted using that standard. And then later, in a later case called Latif, even lowered that standard further by deciding that the lower courts had to give the government's evidence enormous credibility when we knew that it didn't have credibility. And you can even just look at Judge Tatel's dissent in that decision to see how unreliable the evidence was that they were using to keep detainees at Guantanamo. So, that standard, and you see how problematic that standard was by looking at who has been released now. I don't know how that Korematsu-style reckoning is going to happen. Korematsu, of course, is the case that was on the U.S. books for years that justified the detention of thousands of Japanese Americans during World War II and was only recently overturned with, I think it was last year, one of the travel ban cases. But that standard is what is now at play. But I know that really actually challenging that standard and bringing cases is the only hope that many of the detainees who are still there have. It's important that we reckon with that standard because it's what will likely be used if the U.S. does bring more detainees to Guantanamo, which of course the Trump administration is considering. We know that now there are 40 men there, 5 of whom have already been cleared by even the Obama administration for release. Even those who haven't been cleared are men who, we know have been there since they were very young. The evidence against them is very, very weak. But if you use that standard, even very weak evidence will keep detainees at Guantanamo. So at the same time, the Center for Constitutional Rights, and I don't know if, Thomas, you're involved in this, but they are bringing new challenges. And the court that existed and created that standard several years ago is different now, and perhaps there's a possibility of them looking at things in a new way, given what we know. But it's incredibly important that we have that reckoning And I do agree that the courts are probably the best way to challenge that at this point. So thank you all for being here and for your support.
Well, I said I have no idea what to say here. I wake up every day, look at the television for a brief moment, and get very depressed. In the world of Donald Trump, where everything seems terribly crazy and unfair, Guantanamo has even become smaller and less attention to. You know, when somebody's talking about building a wall for $5 or almost $6 billion when it really makes no sense, or lies about this or lies about that, it takes the focus away from this. Who the hell cares about 40 people at Guantanamo today? And saying too, when Guantanamo started, I brought a case on behalf of the Kuwaitis who were there in May of 2002. It's interesting. Let me tell you the history a bit, because something's going on. We brought a case. All we asked for at that time was that there be a fair hearing for these people to see whether there was really a basis for detaining them. We know more now, but we knew then that these people were shipped off to Guantanamo. They weren't captured on any battlefield. They were turned over to U.S. forces, mostly by local tribes people or local governments, in exchange for substantial bounties, which said, you know, feed your family for life, turn in an Arab terrorist. So any Arab there was fair game to turn in. And then they came into the U.S. custody, and they were without a hearing. And the Geneva Convention says if there's any question, you should have a hearing right then. And we did that in the last Gulf War. They were just shipped off to Guantanamo. Every Arab turned in this Afghan-Pakistan area was shipped off to Guantanamo. So we asked just for a fair hearing to see whether there was a basis for it. And that's 17 years ago, and they still haven't gotten a fair hearing. We went to the courts here in D.C., and the courts first said, well, look, because they're aliens, foreigners, without property or presence in the sovereign territory of the United States, they have no rights under the law, no rights under the Constitution, and no access to our courts. The Supreme Court reversed in the Rasool case and said, we may not have sovereign de jure, legal sovereignty over Guantanamo, but we have de facto sovereignty. It's within the territorial jurisdiction of the United States, and these people, as much as American citizens, have the right to habeas corpus under the first statute passed by the first Congress in the United States. Congress then revoked that. Can you believe that? I mean, how could they revoke habeas corpus? They revoked habeas corpus for the people at Guantanamo, and we went back to court and said, you can't do that because it's constitutionally guaranteed. I mean, I think this is sort of interesting. The D.C. Circuit then, same judges said, well, you don't have constitutional rights because these people are just aliens without property or presence in the sovereign territory of the United States, so they have no constitutional rights whatsoever. Went back to the Supreme Court in the Boumediene case. The Supreme Court reversed. And they said, you know, they may not be in the technical sovereign territory, but we control the base, and under long precedent, they have the constitutional right to habeas corpus. We then, habeas cases went back to the courts, and a number of them were won. And then the D.C. Circuit entered an opinion, same judge, and it's really, I think, more important than the cases that you mentioned. The seminal case was the court said, well, they might have the right to have, procedural right to have a hearing, but because they're aliens without property or presence in the United States, they have no right to due process of law. So if you have a hearing, that hearing can take place, and you have no right to due process. So they can't see the evidence against them in most cases. They don't know what the charges are, and they go blind. And there is no effective way to challenge the detentions. It is disgusting that the Obama administration, rather than sort of rejecting those, used those to deny habeas corpus, aggressively asserted those cases to deny habeas corpus, because I think the Obama administration wanted to make decisions itself about who it would release and who it wouldn't. As a result of that, and we tried to get that changed at the end, and said, look, you could, who knows, even somebody like Donald Trump could be elected someday, and you don't want to leave a lawless enclave outside the law for a guy like that to have it. And the Obama administration just poo-pooed it. By the way, Hillary, when she left the State Department, sent Obama a memo saying, you got to close this place, but he didn't. So now we're left with this place, and we're left with a surreal situation with a crazy man as President of the United States who lies and cheats and insults everyone. And that's taken all the steam out of what we can do. So I don't know what to say, except we're in court now trying to restore due process, trying to get the courts to reverse that. If we get that, I think it'll make a significant difference. Let me say the one encouraging fact to me is to see the people who have come here today. This is more than last year or something, and I'm encouraged that people still care. I think the relevant question for us is, what can we do? And I think we've got to effectively go out and elect Democrats now to change the power. We've got to take this country back. Guantanamo, to me, was the start of the United States leaving a path of leaving the path of lawfulness, and really abandoning the principles upon which this nation is founded. I didn't think it could last long, but it really was the first step. You know, I say we can talk about torture, and the fact that we tortured is amazing, but the worst torture for these guys, if you're in Guantanamo, is being stuck there without the ability to have a fair hearing. You're never convicted, never charged for many of them, and you're stuck there without the most rudimentary requirements of the rule of law. So we've got to try to change it. Thanks.
Thanks. So I want to pick up on this question of the route forward, because it really does seem like, at least for the past 2 years and seemingly continuing, there's been just an absolute stalling of any progress towards closing Guantanamo. And then before Trump was elected, you had a different form of stalling under the Obama administration. So there seems that there are three possible routes by which progress towards closing it could be made. There's the executive route, there's the legislature could act, or through the courts. You talked a bit about the courts. We just had a new House elected. Is there any movement on Guantanamo in the House? Do you expect any? And if so, where from?
Well, I know that there were some meetings arranged yesterday with various people in Congress. So some people to do with the various committees on intelligence, and I didn't go to the meetings yesterday, so I don't know all the details. I thought it was very promising that these kind of approaches were being made to lawmakers, because I think it's finally breaking through the complete sense of futility with the legislature that people had for the first 2 years of Donald Trump. When you've got Donald Trump as president and the Republicans controlled both the Senate and the House, what could we do? So I would definitely encourage people to get more involved in speaking to their elected representatives, to start that ball rolling again of, like, you know, politicians, they can make it sound like they're interested, or they can not. They'll give you their ear for a bit. It may lead to nothing, but I think it's important to try and make sure that our voices are once more back in the offices of your elected representatives, making the case for this stain on America's reputation to be removed.
Yeah, I mean, I work with a lot of groups that work on Guantanamo, and we do a lot of work on the Hill, talking to members of Congress. And there is a little bit more hope, I would say, now with the House. I mean, they do have more leverage. The bill that the Guantanamo all the Guantanamo provisions are in is called the National Defense Authorization Act. It's an annual bill that gets passed every year, and the House side will have some leverage in that negotiation process about some of the provisions that are going to be in there. But it's going to be tough with a presidential veto possibility hanging over their heads. But still, there is hope, and it definitely encourage people to be reaching out to their representatives and making their voices heard. So it's a little bit of hope.
I don't think there's much hope.
Okay.
Not with the House. And it's a political mix. You got a president who wants to spend billions of dollars on a silly wall to sort of stir up his base. The last thing he would ever want to do for his base would let somebody out of Guantanamo. I mean, Trump doesn't think of what's right or wrong. He thinks what makes him popular with his base or popular overall. On the other hand, the Democrats, although they will have some leverage with the annual authorization and appropriations bill in military, I doubt whether, I think it's good to talk to them, they're not going to use it on an issue that most of the public doesn't care about and is controversial. They're just, and it would probably be politically unwise for them. So, I don't think there's much hope now. I think the biggest hope is in the courts and unelecting those who are now in power.
So moving to the question of the courts, there's a larger discussion, at least on parts of the left right now, regarding whether the courts are shifting to a sort of generational conservatism. Does that shift, if you accept that that might be the case, affect Guantanamo? Is Guantanamo separate from the sort of traditional legal, conservative, and liberal theories of the court? What does the new justices appointed by Trump mean for Guantanamo these days? And what about the lower courts as well?
Yeah,
That's a legal question. Maybe I'll take that. It's unclear, frankly, what Kavanaugh's appointment to the Supreme Court will mean. It is clear that the retirement of Kennedy really, Kennedy wrote the Boumediene decision. It was a 5-4 decision. It was a decision which clearly recognized the individual rights of the detainees and the basic right to a fair hearing and the reach of the Constitution beyond our technical borders to places we control. It was a great opinion, and he's gone. So it's questionable what Kavanaugh will mean. Kavanaugh was his clerk and respects him and may not want to jab him. But more importantly now, in the lower courts, and it's a longer discussion when people say conservative justices are the people appointed by the Bush administration, really, who reached these decisions in the D.C. Circuit. Not that they're conservative. They're more than conservative. I mean, Justice Kennedy and Justice O'Connor are very conservative people politically, but they believe firmly in the principles of the United States, and most importantly, they believed in separation of powers. That says, the big argument in the Guantanamo, in all the Guantanamo cases to start with, the government said, leave it to us. We know what we're doing. We have the responsibility for the security of the nation. Let us decide who to detain and who to release. And the courts, by O'Connor and Kennedy and Stevens, stepped in and said no, that the courts have an essential role to play as a check against executive detentions. Essential. We need to play that role through the writ of habeas corpus. The people who have been appointed after that, they don't believe in that. They believe in deference to executive power. I mean, people don't understand that. They say Trump doesn't understand it. Oh, let's appoint conservative judges and justices. These people are ideologues who don't believe in separation of powers, really, and that's the critical difference. Now, I think it's very important to get these cases before the courts now, because Trump is packing the courts. So there might be a window to get favorable decisions now that there won't be in the future. As I said, if we restore due process to Guantanamo, we will have made a huge step.
Yeah, I would just to add that, I mean, Kavanaugh was one of the 3 judges who didn't refuse to give teeth to the Boumediene decision on that D.C. Circuit panel, right? So
Which panel?
the Al-Bahani, I think, he was on that panel. So, you know, I don't know. I'm not hopeful for him.
No.
And also, he's so deferential to, you know, yeah, exactly what you said, deferring to the government on national security claims. Though there are a lot of alignments with him and Kennedy, I'm a little worried that that's where there's going to be the tipping point.
Well, that will be the tipping point.
Yeah.
Well, before we move on from the questions of the politics of Guantanamo, I think I do have to ask, as the 2020 campaign begins to take shape in the primaries, do you expect Guantanamo to make an appearance either in the primaries or the general? And do you see any hope for closing it coming down the pike with a potential Trump exit?
With the Trump exit? I mean, yes.
Yeah, if he leaves, if we get somebody else, yeah.
Yeah, but I would doubt that it's going to be an issue during the campaign. I mean, it'd be great if it was, but I would be very surprised. It barely came up in 2016 at all, so I doubt it would be in this race as well, unfortunately.
But I agree with Andy. I agree. I agree with Andy, though, that it's important for everyone here to write their congressman, to write it. So, you know, they're aware of it. They're aware it's important. But I don't think it's going to rise to a level. It's 40 people down there with the crazy man, and you know, there are other things more important.
But the political way forward is that, you know, it could be that if Trump goes, if the Democrats were to get in, if people are making enough noise about making Guantanamo an issue again, then we could be in a better place in several years' time than we are now. But, you know, we're going to have to keep meeting every year. You all know that anyway.
So,
And there's better chances that the Senate may go Democrat next.
Yeah, that would be.
And then we might have some leverage there.
so this past year, they ran a sort of drill at Guantanamo for the possibility of putting in new people, seemingly specifically individuals from the fight against ISIS in Syria. They say that wasn't for anything in particular, and there's no immediate plans. Do you expect new people to end up in Guantanamo in the next 2 years?
I mean, it would be so unfortunate if that happened. I do think that there is a lot of resistance in both the Department of Defense and the Department of Justice to making that happen, both because it complicates the argument for keeping detainees there, because the standard, it's not clear that it would necessarily apply to new ISIS detainees, but also because I do think the Department of Defense and the Justice Department recognize that it's a failure, that the military commissions are a failure, and that it's not in the U.S.'s national security interest to continue Guantanamo and keep it open. You know, whether or not this administration and other senators, like I heard Lindsey Graham the other day was calling for that possibility again. Make a decision, that's stupid, but it's definitely possible.
Yeah, I think if somebody says to Donald Trump or Lindsey Graham says it, it'll help you in your campaign if you put some more people in Guantanamo. It's red meat to his base. Yeah. I think it's possible.
I would hope not. There's a little glimmer of hope there that enough people within the DOD and the DOJ know that it is a place where justice goes to die. If you want to do things like hold people indefinitely without charge or trial and abuse them, it's got a track record. It's got a track record of that. But I think if they're dealing with ISIS prisoners and they want to deliver justice, if they're dealing with anyone and they want to deliver justice, then The federal courts are clearly the place to do it. So I'm hoping that whoever is keeping him in check about his wildest impulses to send new people there, that those people are still there to advise him.
Well, yeah, I'm sorry, Andy, I didn't mean it. It is only attractive to people with the view that you want. Guantanamo was opened by the Bush administration for one reason. They thought following the law would be an impediment in the war against terrorism. So they wanted to avoid the law. And they had an argument, if you hold people beyond the sovereign territory of the United States, you have no legal obligations. The only attraction of Guantanamo to people with that sort of view is if it's beyond the law. That's why I felt if we could restore due process to Guantanamo, bring it back within the law, and by the way, then the presumptions can be examined, there's no incentive to do it now. It's for them to send people to a lawless enclave because it won't be lawless. So that's our
To what
hope.
extent have we seen the sort of supposed trick of Guantanamo where it was claimed to not be under U.S. control and thus not have legal protections being recreated in American detention policy by use of partner forces where either it's, Syrian Democratic Forces or UAE partners in Yemen are carrying out detention of terrorism suspects that we may finger or otherwise help guide, even perhaps participate in raids to capture, but insists that we don't have actual control. Is there legal aspects from the Guantanamo disputes that can help shape policy on that? What's the sort of human rights vision for detention policy in a potentially post-Guantanamo world, whether or not it's post-Guantanamo by actually resolving it or just because no one ever wants to put people into Guantanamo, even if it's never actually closed?
Well, I mean, and it's really a legal question. The only way, the way we prevailed in both the Rasul case and the Boumediene case was because Guantanamo is really not foreign. It is totally controlled by the United States. A person put into Guantanamo has no access to Cuban courts. As Judge Gibbons said in arguing the case, you know, putting a Cuban stamp on it and trying to mail it to Fidel Castro wouldn't work. I mean, it's a totally American place. And so the court's view, this is really America. What a sham to say it's beyond that. Now, the D.C. Circuit rejected a similar claim with respect to Bagram, to people held there, because it said, look, you know, there it is a foreign territory and there's still foreign control, and the intrusion of the United States law there to supersede the local law really isn't right. I think the courts would go along with that and say, if you have a place in a foreign country where foreign officials are involved and foreign courts even can be appealed to, the United States law shouldn't apply. The real answer there is this is a disgusting thing to do, and the United States should not be involved in it, in allowing torture or holding people beyond the law wherever it is. It's a political decision that should not be made. Ward, you think basically?
Yeah, no, I mean, they're definitely, the U.S. is engaged in operations with partner forces in Syria and Iraq and Yemen, and they are very carefully, you know, keep trying at least to try to make a separation between them and the partner forces. And we know the partner forces in Yemen have been accused of horrific forms of torture. We've documented it. Amnesty has documented it. Even a UN report documented it, but the U.S. only recently, I think in the last week, claims that they have no knowledge of any of that torture, and that the forces that they're working with are not under Leahy law obligations. So, and in Syria, in the northern part of Syria, they are holding other detainees. Well, their partner forces are holding other detainees, and the U.S. helps them and gives them support and funds their detention centers, but also claims that they have no control over what happens there. So yeah, I mean, it's how the U.S. is engaging in those in trying to keep a distance from their partner forces engaging in that. We did have the one case of the American who was detained in Iraq, the John Doe case that the ACLU brought on his behalf, and there was some possibility of the courts maybe having a different view than they did in the Bagram cases in that case, but they ultimately ended up, because they were forced by the ACLU, releasing him after they held him for about, I think it was more than a year. But that was because he was an American citizen.
U.S. citizen.
But yeah, unfortunately, the courts have decided that people that the U.S. detains outside of U.S. borders don't have those habeas rights. And on top of that, the U.S. works with partner forces, and those partner forces do what they do, and the U.S. tries to keep a distance from that.
Let me just say one thing. What we really worried about before the Boumediene case is that and they were actually thinking of this, going around different countries and having little territories within our prison, within the country, say, look, you retain ultimate sovereignty, but give us total control within that prison, creating little Guantanamo's at different places. And I think the Boumediene case made pretty clear they can't do that. Some territory where they have total control. But the gap is that they could farm it out to their Yemenis partners.
Mm-hmm.
So my last question before we throw it out to the audience, returning to sort of the political future. We've seen some odd sort of alliance building in politics surrounding other parts of the war on terror in the past year or so, sort of a right-left alliance on the Yemen war, some other authorization of military force issues. Are we seeing similar signs of that happening on Guantanamo, or is Guantanamo still a very polarized sort of issue where there's not a set right-left alliance being built?
The one.
I'm not sure I understand the key.
No,
I understand the question exactly.
Are Democrats and Republicans getting together on Guantanamo as they are on some of?
Yeah.
No, I haven't seen that a lot because people want to. Democrats don't want to make 40 people in Guantanamo an issue now, even if they're very concerned about it. What I think is a possibility going forward is very interesting. There's something in the Post about it today. But the military guys who are now coming out and criticizing Trump, these are guys, and they were always great supporters in our Guantanamo cases, writing things. I think that their voice coming out, I mean, many of them we know are not only against torture, they're against Guantanamo because it's an embarrassment to them, to the military, to what they believe in. I think that they would be a ripe source to sort of prod into this. If you've got McRaven and Mattis and, I don't know how Kelly, but, they could be a force to bring people together, I think. So.
And I guess one last follow-up for y'all. Is there any political force within the actual governing set that's willing to actually deal with the so-called forever prisoners issues and that set of prisoners? Or is that even beyond what most of the Democratic Party's Guantanamo stance would be were they to
I think it's a problem
take
that
sufficient power?
is only really at the moment being focused on, in that this is the 26 forever prisoners at Guantanamo. So the ones, not the 5 approved for release who haven't been released by Trump, or the 9 who have been involved in the trial system, is that they're subject to the periodic review boards, the parole type process that President Obama set up, which approved the release of 38 men, and 36 of those were freed in the last few years of Obama's presidency. Now, no one has been approved for release by the periodic review board since Trump took office. You could say partly that's because the people that they've got left are all the bad people, but we know that that's not true because some of them are, as I said earlier, just foot soldiers. A lot of people there are artists making the most amazing work if the Pentagon lets them, who have done nothing wrong apart from not having a great attitude about how they've been treated. And yet, when the periodic review boards under Obama were swaying on these and in some cases deciding that someone had made enough of a case that they really would like to get on with their lives now, they're getting a lot older, they really don't mean any harm against the United States, they were getting released. Not a single decision suggests to me that this has been politicized, so that the review process has been politicized under Trump, where the default position is don't approve any of these people for release. And I think that needs discussing. I think people who are dealing with the Guantanamo issues obviously have to have a close look at the periodic review boards. Do they function anymore? Because if they are never ever going to approve another prisoner for release, then surely it's not working. So it has been rendered redundant under the Trump administration.
Let's take some questions. Let's do here.
Andy Worthington mentioned.
If you can just wait for the mic. It's coming.
Here.
In the red.
Here.
Ohio State guy.
Thank you. Andy Worthington mentioned earlier that rather than people waiting for those leaders in power to decide who is going to make the next move, that we need to continue making noise. Could you suggest to us what are the most effective ways that we can continue to make noise?
Well, I think that the people who are gathered here today from Witness Against Torture and other campaigning groups, we've all been doing this for years. We've been trying to be out there and to make our case, and I don't think there's much more we can do. But always keep thinking. One of the great things about campaigning is that we're very creative people. We're always thinking, what can we do that might actually have an impact? And 4 years ago, I was lucky enough that when I'd made a mad suggestion, a woman that I didn't know thought it was a great idea and followed it up, and we made a giant inflatable figure of Shaka Arma, the last British resident in Guantanamo Bay. And it became one of those things that grabbed people's attention, and it undoubtedly helped to secure the release of Shaka Arma from Guantanamo Bay. So from an activist point of view, we just have to keep thinking, and maybe we'll come up with a great idea that will attract people and make them understand what's going on. Otherwise, we're stuck in Trump land, and all we're doing is seeing tiny little chinks of light of avenues that may be worth doing. I think what's clearly come out for me out of this is, please take an interest in what Tom and other lawyers are doing in the courts and do what we can to support them. But start approaching your elected representatives to let them know that as a voter, you're waking up every day absolutely sick that this place is still in existence.
Mm-hmm. And I do know that Senate staffers and House of Representative staffers tell us that phone calls actually do help. So when there are key decisions to be made on legislation, for example, and a member of Congress gets a flood of telephone calls, I would say the emails aren't necessarily as good, the kind of formulated prefab emails that people are encouraged to send out, but phone calls actually do have an impact, although it's best to use those when there's some decision that needs to be made and they get flooded with that. But I think continuing to call your representatives and let them know that this still is an important issue to you is very key.
Other questions? Let's continue in the back there.
Thank you all for your, I know you've worked very hard, the panelists, on this issue for a long time, and I know it can be very discouraging. My name is Daphne Aviatar. I work with Amnesty International US, and we also worked on Guantanamo for a long time. I'm a little more enthusiastic about the possibilities of the new House, new Congress, and I think there's a lot they can do, and I would like to encourage people. First of all, we have a campaign specifically for Tawfiq al-Bahani. I got postcards. I got all sorts of things we can send. He's been cleared for release for 8 years. He was tortured by the CIA. It's been determined that there's no reason for him to be held. He's still being held. Congress, and this is if you're going to call your Congress members, they need to hold hearings. Why do we have 5 men who have been determined not to be a security threat? They've never been charged with a crime. They've never been charged with committing violence. They're still stuck there. Many have been cleared for 8 years. That is unconscionable, and that's because Trump dismantled the State Department and the offices that were designed to help transfer people out. Now, under Obama, that all happened very slowly, and that was disappointing, but people were moving out. There was a process. It doesn't exist under Trump. Those offices have been closed. So I would say the first thing is tell your Congress members to hold hearings on why those offices have been closed, why the State Department has been taken apart so that it cannot do its job. And this is a critical role for the State Department. Closing Guantanamo is critical for the State Department in terms of just a matter of foreign relations. So I would say that, and then as Laura mentioned, when the NDAA comes up, there are some very important provisions that Congress needs. Obama couldn't close Guantanamo ultimately because Congress made it impossible. So Congress needs to lift, well, in part.
No, he had the authority and he just didn't do it. And
Okay, well, you can
that's a
respond,
myth.
but let me just
That is
say,
a myth that people say. It's absolutely wrong.
Well,
okay,
let's
it's
take
still
that
very
to
important
the,
for Congress to lift the transfer restrictions on transfer to the United States. That's the last thing I want to say, so that the next president can close it.
Well, let's take that to the panel. I don't know if you want to go into the question of Obama's responsibility and how that played out, but the question of oversight and both what possibility does that have, and if you could give one Guantanamo or detention policy related oversight issue that a new House could and should take up, what would it be?
Well, I'd just like to follow up on what Daphne said about the envoys, because it's extremely important to mention that the role of the envoy for Guantanamo closure, which was set up under Barack Obama, was shut down by Donald Trump. And that's not only that this envoy dealt with resettlement of prisoners, because Trump and his supporters can turn around and say, well, we're not releasing anybody, so who cares about resettling people? It wasn't just that. These envoys also followed up on released prisoners. So from a national security point of view, one that should appeal to Republicans as much as Democrats, having no government office that deals with Guantanamo is not actually sensible from a security point of view. So I think that finding ways to try and shine that light on Congress to say, you need to have somebody in the government representing, looking after the Guantanamo issues, one way or another, would be very, very helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. That's one thing they could ask for. And also, as Daphne mentioned, lifting the restriction on transfers to the United States when the NDAA comes up. Yeah, I think those would be important.
But you know, one of the things that's happened with the closure of the envoy office over the last year is that 2 men who were resettled in Senegal and thought that they were safely resettled in Senegal, because one of them in particular, they're Libyans, one of them in particular really didn't want to be sent back to Libya, were repatriated to Libya and have disappeared, and we presume that they'd been killed. And this was because there literally is no one in the Trump administration that anyone can talk to about any issues involving former Guantanamo prisoners. We also have nearly 24 men that were transferred to the United Arab Emirates that were supposed to go through a rehabilitation program and then be released. And the latest that I know about that is that many of them have not been released. They are stuck in ongoing imprisonment in the United Arab Emirates. Again, the same problem. No one has anyone in the United States government to talk to. That's an absolute disgrace. So that's a really good thing to look at. Yeah.
And there's one more provision that you can push for in the NDAA, which is the possibility of plea agreements happening at Guantanamo. There are a number of prisoners that are there and would plead to something, and that could resolve some of their cases, but that plea provision keeps not getting passed as part of that annual bill. I don't know, Thomas, if you want to talk about, I mean, I do feel like Obama is to blame for a lot of why the prisoners are there, but
he had the authority for the last 8 years to close Guantanamo and doing it, and he kept denying it and said, "Oh, Congress has stopped me," and he, you know, anyway, I don't think it is. The issue, look, all these things are so disgusting, so immoral, so wrong, and we should all be very upset about them. The question is, you know, question is what to do about them. And I know Ann and other people have questions. I just want to say one thing. One thing, and aside from people being here, that gives me hope. You mentioned Slahi's book, My Guantanamo Diary. That's a fabulous book. It reminds me very much of, I don't know whether it was, what was Into the Whirlwind, about the Stalinist camps, you know, by Sonia. Yeah, it was just fantastic. But the craziness of being in Guantanamo, where whatever you said was distrusted, it wasn't believed, that all you could do was lie, this surrealist thing, that's going to be made into a movie now. And if that movie comes out and you see in a personal way what the suffering is of being caught in this crazy thing, could make a difference. I mean, how do you build people to care again about treating Muslim men, you know, fairly? I mean, so I think I'm hopeful those sorts of things. As I said, I'm not hopeful that the House is going to be able to do much in the NDA, or they will, but that's okay.
I
shut up.
Since you brought up Slahi's book, I have to acknowledge that Larry Seams, who edited that book with Slahi, is in our audience today. So we all have to thank him for that.
Now, which is?
He's raising his hand in the back.
Oh,
He has.
In the back.
This is, you know, just an opportunity to sort of fill out this point about the continuing limbo that released prisoners live under. And just to mention specifically Mohamedou Slahi's position, he, you know, like all prisoners when he was released, there was some kind of secret security agreement with the Mauritanian government that included total travel ban, that he couldn't leave the country. He was told at the time that that was a 2-year travel ban. 2 years just passed. He was, you know, there's nobody at the State Department, as we know, but he was getting signals that he could go ahead and apply for a passport. He applied for his passport. The Mauritanian government denied the passport application and said at that time they checked the files, and it's actually a 3-year travel restriction. So now he's waiting another year. But that kind of, you know, that's the situation that all of the released prisoners that were in the Obama administration, those who were released under Obama, had, you know, secret agreements with the receiving countries. We don't know what the terms of those are. They're inaccessible. The men don't know what they are. You know, under this administration with no one at home, as you say, with an empty desk at the State Department, there's no one even to talk to. So, you know, it's just a kind of a vivid example of someone who's, you know, managed to be in communication with the world despite this travel ban, but his position is exceptional in that respect.
Let's go over to the side, in the front, I guess.
Yeah, he's calling him.
All right. Okay, thank you all. I guess I have 2 questions that I'd like your comments on, both, I guess, of a legal nature. My thought on why ISIS or any other prisoners will not be transferred to Guantanamo has to do with something fundamental from the Rasul decision, which, you know, persisted, and that is simply the right to counsel. As you all recall, until 2006, we didn't even know the names of prisoners at Guantanamo, although things started to come out in late 2004, 2005, because they were entitled to counsel. Even if they subsequently had no substantive rights, they had somebody who at least could come back to the United States and, you know, talk to journalists, even, you know, amateur journalists like me. But that was more than they wanted, more than the Bush administration wanted, even to recognize these people as having names rather than, you know, internment serial numbers. And so my first suggestion is, can you comment on that prospect, the fact that regardless of that the habeas is academic at best, in light of, you know, Kiemba 1 or 2, whichever one doesn't let them come back to the United States, that alone, that the ability to have counsel will be enough of a reason as a deterrent to use Guantanamo for anything beyond the 40 men. My second question is more specific. For some reason, it seemed to be technical, but in the recent CCR habeas opinion, the D.C. Circuit denied the government's request to extend its time for briefing based on the government shutdown. I'm wondering if there's anything at all to read into that, or if that's just a quirk of them wanting to move their docket. And thank you.
I'm going to, Tom.
Well,
Tom
on the
knows.
technical question, why they didn't extend it, the court is actually itself scheduled to run out of funds on the 18th. And I thought they don't want to extend it because if they do, they don't know when they'll get it. And so my expectation is they're going to turn down that petition for en banc, and they know it. But they didn't want to extend it. I think the point you made about counsel is a very good one. I mean, one of the, although it might not have been effective in other ways, and I hadn't thought about this, winning the right to have these people represented by counsel has exposed and identified who they are, and that may be an incentive for the Trump administration not to send people there. It's a good point.
Did you have comments on that?
No.
I think there was on the front and right here.
Yeah, hi, and thanks for doing this panel. I just wanted to build on the point that what really helps is to put a human name and a human face on these stories like Mohamedou Salahi. And I'll give you two examples. I spent 12 years representing a man named Ravil Mengazov, and Tom helped on that case as well, and Andy followed it very closely. He was once a professional ballet dancer. He's one of the men stuck in the UAE right now, and we've had no one to talk to for 2 years in the State Department to follow up and enforce the conditions that we thought were in place to assure Ravil's freedom and safety from rendition to Russia, which would be his worst case scenario. We hope to have breaking news soon, but his story is that he's a wonderful man, he's a great ballet dancer, and what was he doing in Guantanamo? I can't explain it to this day, but I'll leave you with one last name. I have a client right now that I'm helping with, and I've been down to Guantanamo a few times recently. His name is Ahmed Rabbani, and he's one of those artists that is an incredible painter. He paints prolifically every day in his cell. He's also been hunger striking, and we're trying to figure out how to get his art liberated from Guantanamo. It's art. He paints pictures of flowers and boats and nature scenes. We're hoping that that's a very human way to show the world. This is a man who's creative and has something good to show the world, trying to stage an art show, because we're sort of out of options in the courts. We're sort of out of options on the legislative branch, so it's that public attention in a very personal way that recognizes someone's human story that can really be their best hope. I'm hoping this movie really starts to move in that direction as well. So keep paying attention to the stories, and when you talk about Guantanamo, try to personalize it with a name of somebody and what you know about their story, and not just sort of the legal outrage and the moral outrage in a general sense, which we all share, which we all try to live with every day. But keep a name on it. So Ahmed Rabbani is his name. He's one of the 40 men that's still there, and we're working as hard as we can with Reprieve, who you all know about, to try to bring his story to the public's attention. Thanks.
Let's get in the front here.
Another movie point. I recently saw Vice, produced by Brad Pitt, and an extraordinary part of it was that Guantanamo made it into a major, well-produced, fascinating film in a critical way. And another contribution I felt of that film was the tracing of what came out of the mind of Dick Cheney, and the Federalist Society and this kind of fascist core that came out of the Bush regime and has delivered wholesale these powers to Trump and Pence, was an understanding that grew even while I was watching the film of how much they needed Guantanamo. They needed a place outside the law that was outside of the reach. They needed it. They still need it. I don't believe they're going to give up on it. without a huge outcry from the population. So films like this and stories like this are incredibly important, but Congress is not going to stop this. They didn't stop it under Obama. It's going to take the people. It is going to take millions of us standing up and saying no. And the work that all of you do is so critical to that. We need the court cases to fight around. We need the exposure. We need the stories. We need to make it human. And most of all, we need people to understand that Guantanamo right now is not just about only the 40 men there, but it is really about, is the strongest military power in the world going to be able to lock people up forever without charges, or no? Do we say no?
The lady with white hair back.
Do you want to address the sort of cultural question? Has the cultural representation gotten better? Are we seeing advances on that?
Oh yeah, definitely, I think. I mean, I haven't seen Vice yet, but I hear really good things about it. And I read a great interview with the guy who did it. And I recognized that thing. He was ill, he was reading about Cheney, and he suddenly realized just quite how bad Dick Cheney was. And he got totally into the story. And then it, you know, then you realize what's going on, because Cheney was behind so much of this. And David Addington.
Yeah.
But the Slahi film, I would hope, if this is done well, really could be major, because what Slahi's book did for liberal America was really significant. But that wasn't the entire population. If you can put a film on, if you can make a movie and get that out there that really is not Zero Dark 30, but is actually the opposite of that, Mohammedou's story of what actually happened, then that could really change the way people think.
Let's see that lady back there.
Sure.
No. Yeah.
Thank you. My question has to do with the due process issue. Let's assume, happily, that you win on the due process issue with the courts. What then happens? I mean, I know it's not going to be all, you know, sugar plums and roses, but I just would like to know. Thank you.
Two things. You know, first of all, for those who are held without charge, they could have a hearing and effectively rebut the evidence against them. Now they can't even see it. In the courts, yeah, in the courts. The courts, you know, the idea is that the D.C. Circuit said, Judge Raymond Randolph, is that if you're outside the sovereign territory of the United States, you have no due process rights. Due process is the fundament of our law. It really, the Fifth Amendment says you can't be deprived of your liberty without due process of law. What does due process mean? It basically means you have a right to have notice of the charges and evidence against you and a fair opportunity to rebut them. People haven't had that. So it will mean that some of those people can get out. Beyond that, there are some possibilities that due process can go farther than that and say that certain of the things being done violate fundamental fairness. So those are challenges in the future. Also, it's really what you said, that if they have, the attraction to it now, to Guantanamo, is it's outside the law. While they have lawyers, the lawyers can't do anything but go down in there and hold their hand. I mean, you know, it's sort of a pathetic situation, and bring them food when they could and do. But if they have the rights of the law, there's less reason to send anyone there. Now, maybe then they'll do what David said, you know, they'll just keep them in Yemen or do it in Yemen prisoners, but it will close Guantanamo off as a place outside the law. So.
I think there was right here in front there.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for all the information you have provided and encouragement of doing different things and looking into different ways of bringing attention. But this morning, we heard from Pardis Kebriai from Center for Constitutional Rights that she's the one who has been one of the lawyers who has been going back and forth to Guantanamo. She sees a lot, and that really caught my attention. And now we are talking about how to close this place, how to end this place. She's talking about expansion of building, new buildings are going on. Considering what we have right now, what is happening right now, what has happened during Vice's introduced to the movie theaters. I haven't seen it, and I'm looking forward to see that. And then we have this, I call them, if not fascist, but neo-fascist group that are in power, and they are trying to take every little of constitution that is left to shred it. Now we are hearing they are building more and more concrete, or whatever they are doing in Guantanamo, and now they are talking about national emergency. What is going to happen? How we can have any hope for Guantanamo?
I would say that one of the things that it seems to me about Guantanamo is the place is falling apart. So because they know that they're not releasing anyone imminently, then they have to spend a lot of money on building work. But the cost of Guantanamo is one of those things. One of the things is that we all must never forget that there are some people with very dark hearts in this country who like holding people without charge or trial indefinitely. I decided these are bad guys. They have no rights. There also appear to be other people in positions of power and responsibility in this country who relish spending at least $11 million a year on every single prisoner that they're holding at Guantanamo. Money is no object for them. How do they constantly get away with it, that money is no object in this ridiculous place where everything costs such a lot of money for everybody involved to get things to and from Guantanamo?
So I wanted to ask you all about that. I saw that this year there was some reporting from Guantanamo about the budgeting going forward, where they're looking to expand it for 25 years, but it's also being held up, and it hasn't, I may have missed a follow-up report on that, but it hasn't been dispersed yet. Is that a leverage point? Is that somewhere where things can happen? Is it, what's happening with that?
I have heard that there is a lot of new construction at Guantanamo. I haven't been there since March this year, but or last year, but I'm not sure why there is the budget issue with why certain funds haven't been released. They do still use Guantanamo for other things. There is a whole interdiction. The Coast Guard interdicts all these people and keeps them on boats, and some of them actually, in drug cases, some of them actually make a transition before they make it to the United States. They take them to Guantanamo. But a lot of that stuff you don't see that in the public domain. So I'm not sure that just because there's new construction necessarily means that they're planning to bring new detainees there or anything like that. But it is interesting, and it's curious what's actually going on. Yeah.
Another thing we've sort of seen is recent legal actions on military commission cases that I think they recently decided the FBI clean team wasn't so clean after all, that because there had been a memorandum of understanding and some pretty close cooperation, including on actual questions with the CIA teams that were involved, or at least the larger institution involved in torture, that wasn't admissible. What do you see happening on that front and the military commissions over the next year to 2 years?
Two-word answer from me: Groundhog Day. That's all the military commissions are. They just go round and round and round and round and never get any resolution.
Yeah, I mean, the military commissions are a complete disaster. Partly, we're now, I think, in the sixth year of pretrial hearings in the 9/11 case, maybe more. That is not, it's injustice both for the victims of the crime and for the defendants that are on trial. And I don't see any improvement on that front whatsoever. They're an abomination, and yes, there was a recent good decision, I suppose, in that the judge in the 9/11 case ruled that some of the information obtained from the defendants who are on trial by a clean team, which was an FBI team that came in years after the defendants were tortured, couldn't be used in their cases. But we have no idea whether that is going to have any resonance going forward or whether it's going to be appealed and overturned. I mean, those cases are just, basically stuck, and it's appalling what's happening there with the military commission cases.
I'm not involved in the military commissions. I'm involved in the people who aren't charged, which I think is the greatest, injustice and actually torture of them to be there that way. But the military commission issue is interesting, even as it plays out. Most of the people charged through the military commissions, if they had been tried in the U.S. in the judicial system, would have been convicted long ago. So the lawyers for those in the military commission sort of rejoice that nothing has happened and that they've become a silly thing because they've been able to delay it all this time. It is an absolute joke, but the lawyers, they're fighting, they think it's terrible, but they'll recognize, and many of them pushed to have their clients tried by the military commission because they knew they could delay it and it's a joke. So that's one side. It's very interesting. Now, I've always opposed them because I think it's the whole idea that you need to avoid our judicial system and create new things because of the war on terrorism is absurd. The guy mostly responsible for that should pay a price for it, and he hasn't. It's Lindsey Graham. Lindsey Graham was the guy who said, oh, these guys are, they're guys in the war, and we should try them through commissions rather than a judicial system, which really empowers people. It creates people as warriors rather than in criminals, and it really set up a system that couldn't work. And yet he goes around scot-free on this. He is the creator of this. He is so stupid on it and hateful, and he should pay a price, and nobody's making him do it. So that's just my comment on
I
it.
just note that we keep a database here at New America of jihadist terrorism-related cases of people in the U.S. And I think since 9/11, for a range of crimes with some of them very minor, there's been maybe 4 acquittals, and they've been for some very questionable cases. And then in terms of people actually brought from abroad, I don't think anyone has been acquitted in full in a U.S. federal court. So it's really not clear that the Justice Department and justice system can't handle such cases when they come to the U.S. In fact, arguably, there's questions regarding the dangers of such a high conviction rate in the U.S. and why we generate that.
You're absolutely right. The federal courts can handle these cases. They've got the procedures to do it and all that. And this is another Obama fault. The fact that he backed down on trying Khalid Sheikh Mohammed in the United States is disgraceful. And, and his attorney general, or whatever he said, backing down and screwing it up, disgraceful.
I think we have time for 1 or 2 last questions. Do we have anyone in the back here? Let's go to the back there.
I'd just like some happy news. How's Shaka Amr?
Well, I haven't seen Shaka Amr for a while, but we have communicated by email, and I hear that he's doing very well. Just getting on with trying to rebuild his life after all those years in Guantanamo, and of his children growing up not knowing who he was, and his wife, who had found it extremely difficult with him being away. So the last I heard from him was in June, when I was with the campaign. We were marking 6,000 days of Guantanamo, and I sent him a message going like, Shaka, please, if you can get a photo and a little message, it would be really helpful. And he sent a great message to Donald Trump, and also didn't just send me a photo. He sent me about half a dozen, all with him sitting and having his hair in different ways. I didn't ask for a fashion shoot, but So I think, I'm looking forward to seeing him again. He's a very charismatic and compelling character in real life, as he always was in Guantanamo. And the thing about Shaka that always gets me is that Shaka relentlessly talks about the need to combat injustice in the world. I don't know how in Guantanamo they turned that into him being a terrorist. I honestly don't get it. This is a man whose every impulse is to bring us together, not to sow these kinds of seeds of division. And it was his charisma that got to them. Presumably they were all lacking in charisma themselves.
So do we have one last question? Sure.
Thank you. I wanted to, Partis had mentioned the problem with severe health problems of many of the men, and I'm wondering if that could be used to help them to get health care in the United States. You had mentioned that, if that could be a way to move people out. And I also want to ask about international pressure and whether there's anything that could be done through international means.
Well, can I just say, you've got a doctor here who's trying to help people in Guantanamo, and
I'm working with one patient down in Nashville who's been through 5 operations. Who's been transferred to one patient down there who's been transferred to Miami and operated on. He'd been fine. Instead, they did it in Gitmo with not all the equipment they needed. Had a real problem with it, and now he's had 5 procedures. He's still in pain. So it'd be much cheaper to bring him to Miami, do it, and send him back. But he went down there with young, very nice surgeons, not experienced, but young surgeons without the right equipment, and did a poor job. Now he's done 5 procedures, and he's still in pain.
Well, that's about all the time we have. Do you have any concluding remarks? Anything to flag up for the next year?
I mean, let's just keep our fingers crossed for these new cases that are being brought in the new habeas cases. A number of them have very compelling stories. Those stories are available on CCR's website. I know they're a lead counsel in those cases. They are prisoners who are considered forever prisoners, but their stories are, unbelievably compelling. They've been there for 16 years. Very little, if any, evidence against them. They're, we have to keep supporting that, and hopefully Thomas will be successful in his pursuits as well.
Well, let me say, I feel like I've been such a downer on these things, because I think while Donald Trump is president for the next 2 years, it's going to be very difficult to actually get relief, political relief, getting people out, getting things happening, starting somebody in the State Department, getting that. I don't think it's going to happen, but I think everyone here, whenever they have a chance, telling people, their congressmen and others and their friends, that this is a moral outrage. This is not who we can be, who we are as Americans, what we believe in, and it hurts us. And it does hurt us every day around the world. It hurts us. So keeping getting that message out builds the support, and I'm hoping the Slahi film, I haven't seen Vice yet, but will help and give a stage for that. So I think everyone can do that, then that's important. Ultimately, the solution is going to be political, and we need to take back power.
Thank you, everyone, for caring. Keep telling people why it's important. The one thing I do think that's come out today that I think can attract significant attention from the left and the right is highlighting this notion, this truth, that there is no one in the United States government that deals with former prisoners, that deals with how they're being looked after or not, for our side of things, but also whether they pose a security threat to the United States on the Republican side of things, which I think they need to be on as well. And I think if we could get a presence back in the United States government, that is something that we can work towards. But more fundamentally than that, let's just keep hammering away at getting this place closed. We have to. And I'm sure that most of the people who are here know that we have to. We know the significance of this dreadful place remaining open. So let's keep fighting. Thank you.
Thank you to our panel.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David. Thanks, David.
Okay. I'm going to need to run.